In 1941, the Empire of Japan launched one of the deadliest surprise attacks in history. 4 years later, there was no empire left. So here's a question. Why did Japan actually lose World War II? It might sound simplistic, but the truth is that Japan literally wasn't built to fight World War II. The Japanese islands are mountainous and rocky, which means there isn't a whole lot of suitable farmland. On top of that, the industrial economy of 20th century Japan relied heavily on imports, in particular petroleum and rubber. This scarcity actually drove Japan's imperial ambitions in the first place, as the Japanese hoped to conquer regions that could provide resources to the empire. But it also meant that Japan didn't have the resources to fight the long, grinding war of attrition that the Pacific Theater later became. Instead, Japanese forces needed to launch quick blitzkrieg-style attacks to grab territory as fast as possible, before using that territory's assets to carry on the war effort. And this did actually work at first. In the early days of the Pacific War, the borders of Japan's empire spread at an astonishing rate. Ultimately, though, the better-resourced allies were able to outsupply, outrepair, and outlast Japan. As the supply lines got longer, the Japanese grip got looser. Pearl Harbor might have kicked off Japan's war with the USA, but our story actually begins way earlier. In 1910, Japan forcibly annexed the Korean Empire. At the time, the Western powers were pretty happy for this to play out, since a strong Japan could balance Russia's power in the East, and they definitely weren't going to let anything as silly as justice or human rights get in the way of that. The Japanese crushed the revolt in Korea in 1919, but unrest continued on and off in the years to come. In 1931, Japan reintroduced military rule in the peninsula. Korean civilians were drafted for forced labor, and many were later conscripted into the Japanese army. Eventually, the exiled Korean government pulled together a coalition of Korean exiles and resistance groups, which they named the Korean Liberation Army. It wasn't exactly a formidable fighting force, but the KLA received training from the US Armed Forces and engaged in combat with the Japanese on the Indian and Burmese fronts. Even before World War II rolled around, Japan's colony in Korea had clearly become, at best, an asset with dangerous strings attached. After taking Korea in 1910, Japan's next target for expansion was the neighboring Chinese region of Manchuria.
In 1931, the war we are now fighting began.
The Japanese government manufactured a pretext for invasion in 1931, launching an attack that quickly overran the Chinese defenders. They also tracked down Pu Yi, China's deposed emperor, and put him in charge of a puppet state named Manchukuo. The conquest of Manchuria appeared to be a strong opening salvo for the later invasion of China, especially since the sitting Chinese government was too weak to effectively resist it. But it had its downsides too. Namely, the fact that Manchuria was filled with people who were quite eager to resist the Japanese at every opportunity. Worse still, Japan's attacks against China interrupted an ongoing civil war in the country. The nationalist government of China had been fighting communist rebels since 1927, which had pretty much allowed Japanese forces to move freely in northern China. This changed when the threat of invasion became clear, however, and in 1936, the government and the rebels formed a united front. The deal? Take down the Japanese first and deal with each other later. Had Japan let the two sides batter each other down for longer, they might well have faced less resistance. Germany and Italy led the Axis powers during World War II, but they were aided by a number of lesser allies. Romania's Ion Antonescu helped facilitate the Holocaust in his own country. Finland semi-cooperated with the Nazis to open up another front against the Soviet Union. This was part of the Winter War strategy in their battle against the Soviets, and Hungary and Slovakia sent troops to fight on the Eastern Front. If you weren't aware, the last time the US declared war was June 4, 1942, against Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, many varied foes in Europe. But Japan's allies in the Pacific consisted almost entirely of its own puppet states. Yes, these territories were quote-unquote friendly to Japan, but the Japanese had to invade and occupy them to enforce that friendliness, meaning there was little net gain in terms of fighters and armaments. Japan's one independent ally during the Pacific War was the Kingdom of Thailand, and even they only joined the Axis after a Japanese invasion. It's probably worth mentioning that Japan did also ally with an Indian independence movement called Azad Hind. That said, the Azad Hind relied on Japanese support for their fight against British authorities, making them arguably more of a drain than an opportunity for the overstretched Japanese forces. In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was a massive undertaking designed to utterly destroy the Soviet state, and its failure was arguably the most decisive turning point in World War II. A few months earlier, Japan and the Soviet Union had agreed on a non-aggression pact, but that didn't stop the Japanese from laying out a detailed strategy for their own invasion of the USSR. Under Plan Kantokuen, the Japanese would have used chemical and biological weapons to soften Soviet resistance in the Far East before capturing a chunk of territory contiguous to Manchuria. So this is the area basically across from Japan and the northern parts of the region. If Kantokuen had been enacted, it would have pulled Soviet resources away from the Eastern Front, where they were desperately needed to slow the advance of Hitler's Nazis. But Japan was still fighting in China, and its leaders lusted after the more resource-rich territories to the south, so they decided against invading Russia. Of course, we can't say for sure whether Plan Kantokuen would have handed Hitler a victory over Stalin, but we do know that Japan's decision to ignore the Russians later came back to haunt them. In August 1945, Soviet forces rolled through Manchuria, making colossal gains in a matter of days. It was this invasion, along with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that finally drove the Japanese to surrender. At first glance, the Pearl Harbor attack seems like a clever gambit. If the Japanese Navy could sufficiently damage the U.S. fleet, they would buy time to consolidate the Empire's position while the U.S. struggled to rebuild. Of course, things didn't quite turn out that way.
The American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
In short, Japan's plan failed because the attack failed, or at least it didn't succeed well enough. 3 American aircraft carriers were away from the port during the battle, including the USS Enterprise, which later became one of the American fleet's most valuable assets during the war. Japanese attackers were also so invested in destroying ships and planes that they didn't attack fuel supplies or repair stations. Big mistake. All in all, Japan only fully destroyed a couple of battleships, with many other vessels left damaged but salvageable. These vessels were soon fixed up and sent into war against Japan. Truth is, this blunted sucker punch led directly to a worst-case outcome for the Japanese, as the resource-rich and hitherto isolationist United States was now fully committed to war. By the time America entered the war, Japan was attempting to defend an absolutely massive empire, with fighting taking place across several theaters. The commitment of Japanese forces in 1942 would have badly stretched far better resourced nations, and as the war continued, Japan began to lose this deadly game of whack-a-mole. At the peak of its territorial strength, the Japanese Empire held all of Southeast Asia, Manchuria, Korea, a huge swath of eastern China, nearly all of modern Indonesia, the Philippines, and a vast constellation of smaller islands extending far out into the Pacific. In addition to occupations, Japanese forces were actively fighting in China, along an Indo-Burmese front, and in the sweltering mountains of New Guinea. Frankly, that's kind of a lot. And Japanese military planners soon learned that taking territory is not the same thing as holding it. All those early conquests left the Japanese military weak and overstretched, like we mentioned earlier, which is probably the worst situation you could be in when a nation like the US enters the war. Japan's invasion of China was a brutal and horrific affair, with enormous loss of life on both sides and countless atrocities committed against the Chinese population.
My mother and I were hiding in the basement for weeks, and when we came out, everyone we knew was killed.
Japan's leaders believed this cruelty would break their enemy's spirit, but all it really did was galvanize resistance against the invaders. Yet while Japan occupied huge swaths of China across the course of the war, they never achieved the final victory they so badly needed. After the factions in the Chinese Civil War agreed to unite, China's leadership retreated to the west, where they continued to direct the war against Japan. As such, Japanese control over China was never as thorough as it looked on a map, as the territories that fell to the empire frequently rose up against it. Truly effective Japanese domination was mostly limited to major towns and the transit connections between them, like islands and a sea of angry Chinese fighters. Though Japan controlled most of China's major ports for most of the war, China was also able to receive supplies overland from the British. And by early 1944, the US was delivering material aid and training exiled soldiers in India. In the end, China's bitter resistance against the Japanese invasion paid off, sapping the empire's strength for the duration of the war. Even at the height of Japan's strength, its most powerful foe sat mostly out of reach. From 1942 until the end of the war, the United States could and did hit Japan directly, yet Japanese efforts to retaliate never amounted to more than a nuisance. As early as April 1942, the Doolittle raid saw specially modified American bombers strike a number of Japanese cities, including Tokyo, before landing in friendly territory in China. Not much damage was inflicted by the raid, but it shook Japanese confidence enormously, prompting the empire's military leadership to attack Midway to prevent similar attacks from taking place. They failed, of course, and by the war's end, over 60 Japanese cities had been bombed by the Allies. Meanwhile, Japan was never seriously able to threaten the American homeland, though not for lack of trying. In late 1944, the Japanese military built 10,000 Fugo balloons to carry heavy explosives across the Pacific. These explosives would then detonate over the US mainland, sparking forest fires across the heavily wooded Pacific Northwest. But the balloons were hard to launch and relied heavily on favorable weather conditions. In the end, the grand sum of Japan's effort was 6 dead civilians and a power outage. The Japanese did actually put troops on the ground in North America. The often forgotten Aleutian Islands campaign saw the Japanese attack what is now the state of Alaska. In all, the Japanese lost over 4,000 troops in a little over a year of fighting. By the beginning of 1945, American bombers were able to fly over Japan more or less unopposed. The incendiary bombs dropped by the Allies caused endless destruction in Japanese cities, in which most of the densely packed buildings were made out of wood. One of the war's deadliest air raids took place on the night of March 9, 1945, when 300 American bombers set out to bomb Tokyo. The planes dropped colossal bombs filled with napalm-like propellants, which caused massive fires that were spread even further by the wind. Ultimately, 15 square miles of Tokyo was destroyed and at least 90,000 people were killed. It's also important to remember that this was just one night in a months-long campaign of firebombing, a campaign that spared only 5 Japanese cities. And why were those 5 cities spared, you ask? Simple, to better show off the destructive power of the atomic bomb. Japan's fatal mistake in World War II can be summed up in a single word: hubris. Japan's leaders bet it all on a short and quick victory, yet they were also willing to fight the United States with limited resources and practically no support from allies. As a result, the empire was on the ropes even as the Allies were off doing this.
Bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of Western Europe has begun.
The Japanese never stopped making strategic mistakes either. They thought the Soviets would be out of the war by 1942, allowing them to reassign the troops who'd been stationed in Manchuria to guard against invasion. Japan's leaders also calculated that they could grow enough rice to meet the needs of an expanded, strained workforce and a widely deployed military, but they didn't account for local shortfalls and blockades on food imports. They also expected the US Navy to consist of around 300,000 men by the end of 1943. In reality, they faced a fighting force of around 2 million. In short, Japan planned for the war it hoped to fight rather than the one that was actually taking place, and this flaw proved to be their undoing.